Homeless veteran bullied by immigrants. Sylvester Stallone sees the scene and does the unthinkable. John Callahan sat hunched over on a worn-out bench in a dimly lit alleyway, his thin, calloused hands gripping the edges of his tattered military jacket. The Los Angeles night was cold, but he had long since grown used to the chill. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on him like an invisible force, heavier than the worn-out backpack he kept by his feet. He had been a soldier once, a warrior who had dedicated over 20 years of his life to serving his country. Now he was nothing more than another forgotten face on the streets, a casualty of a system that had no place for him once the battles were over. His body ached from sleeping on concrete, his mind haunted by memories he could never silence. He had seen too much, lost too many, and somewhere along the way the fight had drained out of him. PTSD was a war of its own, one he fought alone. The world had moved on without him, and every night he was left to battle demons that no one else could see. He rarely spoke to anyone. Most people walked past him as if he didn't exist, and in a way, he had started believing that he didn't. Tonight, though he wasn't invisible, a group of young men loitered nearby, their laughter cutting through the quiet street. John had noticed them before, but never paid them much attention. They were immigrants, kids who had likely been dealt a tough hand themselves. They had their own struggles, their own hardships, but tonight they were looking for an easy target. One of them, a lanky teenager with a buzz cut, took a step closer. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice laced with mockery. "You planning on sleeping here all night? This your kingdom?" John said nothing. He had learned long ago that words didn't do much good in these situations. Another boy, shorter but stockier, smirked. "Look at this guy, wrapped up in that old jacket like it. Still means something." He reached out and tugged at John's sleeve, testing him. When John didn't react, the boy laughed and turned to the others. "He's not even going to do anything." The tallest one, the leader, kicked John's backpack, sending it tumbling onto the pavement. A few old possessions spilled out. A small water bottle, a notebook with torn pages, a single picture of a younger John in uniform, standing beside men who weren't around anymore. John's chest tightened, but he still didn't move. He had nothing left to fight with. The buzz-cut teen crouched down and picked up the picture, examining it under the dim glow of a street lamp. "You were in the military, huh?" He snorted. "And now look at you. Guess all that tough guy training didn't get you very far." The others laughed. The leader reached into John's backpack and pulled out a small, battered tin that held what little money he had managed to collect from passing strangers. He popped it open and counted the coins before shoving them into his pocket. "Hey," one of the others said, shifting uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just go." But the leader ignored him. He turned back to John and gave him a small shove, not enough to hurt, just enough to humiliate. "Say something, old man. You got nothing to say?" John looked up then, his tired blue eyes meeting the younger man's. There was no anger in them, no fear, just a deep, aching sorrow. He had seen kids like this before, young men who thought the world owed them something, who thought taking from others would somehow make them stronger. He pitied them, but pity wouldn't stop them. The leader frowned at John's lack of reaction. Maybe he had expected a fight, some resistance, but there was nothing. Just a hollow, broken man sitting in the cold, letting them take what little he had left. Before he could say another word, the sound of a car door slamming shut cut through the night. The group turned, their laughter dying in their throats as they noticed the black SUV parked a few feet away. A figure stepped out, moving with a slow, deliberate confidence. At first, they didn't recognize him. He was wearing a long, dark coat, his face partially shadowed under the streetlights, but then he took another step forward, and the recognition hit them all at once. "Wait a second," the stocky boy murmured. "No way!" Sylvester Stallone stood there watching them. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made even the leader shift uneasily. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at John, then at the boys, taking in the scene. John blinked, barely processing what was happening. Of all the people in the world, of all the places in this city, Sylvester Stallone had just stepped into this moment, and for the first time in a long, long while, John felt like someone had truly seen him. Stallone stood still, his hands in his coat pockets, watching the scene unfold in front of him. The way John sat there, unmoving, absorbing every insult, every act of cruelty, without even a flicker of resistance, struck something deep within him. He had seen that look before, the hollow stare of a man who had already lost too much to fight back. It wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion, the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave. For a moment, it wasn't John sitting there, but a version of himself from years ago, struggling on the streets, wondering how he had fallen so far. He took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough." The young men turned at the sound, sizing him up. They didn't recognize him at first, just another older guy stepping in where he wasn't wanted. The leader, the tallest one, scoffed and folded his arms. "Or what?" Stallone didn't flinch. He had spent a lifetime around guys who puffed themselves up, trying to look tougher than they really were. He had been one of them once. But this wasn't about proving anything. His voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. "I said, that's enough." The stocky one narrowed his eyes, finally recognizing the face beneath the street lamp's dim glow. His expression shifted from defiance to something closer to disbelief. "Wait, no way, that's—" The leader smirked, cutting him off. "Rocky?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Oh, man, what's the matter? You gonna give us one of your big speeches?" The others chuckled, emboldened by their leader's bravado. "Yeah, come on, old man. Show us your moves," another one jeered, throwing a few mock punches in the air. But Stallone didn't take the bait. He didn't step forward, didn't clench his fists. He had nothing to prove. Instead, he sighed, shaking his head. "You think this is funny?" His voice was even, but there was an edge to it, something that made the laughter falter just a little. The leader's grin faded slightly, but he covered it with a shrug. "I think it's pathetic. This guy's got nothing. What's it to you?" Stallone exhaled slowly, looking at John, then back at the kids. "You ever sleep in a bus station?" The question came out of nowhere, catching them off guard. The group exchanged glances. "What?" the stocky one asked. Stallone took a step closer, his eyes locked onto the leader's. "Ever have to sell your dog just so you don't starve?" His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it, an honesty that made it impossible to ignore. Ever get told no so many times you start to think maybe you're not worth a damn? For the first time there was silence. When I was starting out, I had nothing. I mean nothing. Couldn't afford rent, couldn't afford food. I was sleeping in a bus terminal trying to figure out how the hell I got there. And the worst part? Nobody cared. I was just another guy who didn't make it. You know what kept me going?" He tapped his chest. "Heart, not tearing people down. Not laughing at someone who's already on the ground. Heart." The boys shifted uneasily. One of them kicked at the pavement, suddenly interested in the cracks between the asphalt. The leader wasn't ready to back down. "Yeah? And what's that got to do with him?" He nodded toward John, still slumped on the bench, his eyes barely registering the exchange. "What? We supposed to feel bad for some washed-up old man?" Stallone's expression didn't change, but he moved toward John, kneeling beside him. Gently he placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "This man fought for his country." His voice softened, but it lost none of its strength. He gave everything, and what did he get in return? A bench to sleep on and people laughing at him? That's not right. John finally looked up, his tired eyes meeting Stallone's. There was something there, a flicker of recognition, of disbelief that anyone was standing up for him. Stallone didn't say anything else. Instead, He shrugged off his coat, a thick, warm jacket that had shielded him from the cold that night, and draped it over John's shoulders. It wasn't just about warmth. It was a gesture, a sign of respect, of dignity, of reminding the man that he still mattered. The boys stood in awkward silence. The leader looked like he wanted to say something, but the words never came. The weight of the moment had settled over them, pressing down heavier than they expected. They weren't looking at a washed-up actor giving a lecture. They were looking at a man who had lived it, who understood what it meant to have nothing. One of the younger ones swallowed hard. "Come on," he muttered, nudging the leader. "Let's just go." For a moment it seemed like the leader would argue, but then he glanced at Stallone, then at John, then back at his own reflection in the window of a nearby storefront. Whatever. He saw there made his jaw tighten. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. The others followed, their bravado left behind on the pavement. Stallone didn't watch them leave. His focus was on John. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, gripping his arm gently. "Let's get you something to eat." John hesitated, then nodded. For the first time in years, someone had stood up for him. And for the first time in even longer, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he thought. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as Stallone guided John inside. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of late-night regulars nursing their coffee. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving streets John had grown accustomed to. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, recognized Stallone immediately, but he gave her a small shake of the head. No attention, no fuss. Tonight wasn't about him. They slid into a booth near the back, the vinyl seats creaking beneath them. Stallone picked up a menu, but John just stared down at his hands, still gripping the edges of the warm coat draped over his shoulders. He hadn't taken it off since Stallone had given it to him. "Order whatever you want," Stallone said, setting the menu down. "Don't worry about the cost." John hesitated before finally reaching for the menu. His fingers were stiff, slow, as if even the act of choosing a meal was foreign to him. It probably was. When was the last time he'd had a hot meal that wasn't from a shelter or a stranger's pity? The waitress came over, pouring them both a cup of coffee. John mumbled his order: eggs, toast, sausage. Nothing fancy, but real food. Stallone ordered the same. The moment the waitress left, silence settled between them. John shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the window. "Why are you doing this?" His voice was hoarse, rough from years of shouting commands, swallowing pain, and later being ignored. Stallone stirred his coffee, watching the spoon clink gently against the ceramic. "Because I know what it's like to feel like you don't matter," he said simply. John let out a quiet scoff, but there was no real bite to it. "You? Come on, man. You're Sylvester Stallone. You've got money, fame. Hell, you probably got people lining up just to shake your hand." Stallone gave a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, now. But it wasn't always like that." He leaned back, his gaze steady. "Before Rocky, before any of it, I was sleeping in bus stations, couldn't afford rent, couldn't afford food. I was just another guy nobody cared about. I got rejected over 1,500 times when I was trying to sell my script. People laughed in my face, told me I wasn't good enough, and when I had nothing left—" His voice dropped slightly. "I had to sell my dog, my best friend. $50. I didn't even have enough to eat, but letting him go, that broke me." John's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He said nothing, but Stallone could see the words sinking in. The waitress arrived with their plates, setting the food down gently. John hesitated before picking up his fork, as if half expecting the meal to be taken away before he could touch it. But it wasn't. It was his, and for the first time in a long time he ate without fear of when the next meal would come. Stallone watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You fought for others, John. You put everything on the line for this country, but when it was time for someone to fight for you, nobody showed up." John swallowed hard, his fork pausing mid-air. "I lost everything," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "The guys I served with, some of them didn't make it, and the ones who did," he let out a dry chuckle. "They didn't all get a happy ending. Some drank themselves to death. Some ended up like me. Some just disappeared." Stallone nodded, not interrupting, just listening. John exhaled, shaking his head. "I tried, when I got out, I really tried. Held down a job for a while. But the nightmares, the panic attacks, they don't exactly make you the best employee. I started slipping, lost my apartment, then my car. Then," he looked down at himself, "then everything." Stallone reached across the table, gripping John's wrist firmly. "But not you," he said. "You didn't lose you." John stared at him, eyes glassy, his throat working as if trying to force down emotions he hadn't let out in years. "You're still here," Stallone continued, "and I'm not going to let you go down like this." John blinked, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Why?" he asked again, voice cracking slightly. Stallone leaned forward. "Because someone gave me a chance when I was at my lowest, and now I'm giving you one." He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and made a call. John listened in silence as Stallone spoke, his voice steady, direct, no hesitation. He was calling in a favor. "Yeah, it's me. I need to get a guy into one of the veteran housing programs. Yeah, he's clean, just down on his luck. No, I don't want him waiting 6 months. I need him in now." A pause, then a small nod. "Good. I'll take care of the costs." John's breath hitched. His fingers trembled around his coffee cup. Stallone ended the call and set the phone down. "You've got a place, a real bed, a roof over your head, no more benches." John's chest rose and fell, his hands clenched into fists as he tried to process it. He had spent so long being ignored, being cast aside, that hearing someone say, "You have a place," felt unreal. "And that's not all," Stallone added. "I talked to a buddy of mine. He runs a boxing gym. He's looking for someone to help out, maybe train a few kids, keep the place running. Thought you might be interested." John opened his mouth, then closed it. He stared down at his plate, then at Stallone, then back down again. His whole body trembled. I don't even know what to say," Stallone smiled. "Say yes." John let out a shaky breath, his eyes welling up despite himself. He hadn't cried in years, had promised himself he wouldn't, but here he was, breaking that promise in the middle of a dingy diner, because for the first time in years he wasn't alone. He wiped at his face roughly, nodding once, then again, stronger this time. "Yeah," he whispered. "Okay." Stallone clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Now finish your food. We've got work to do." John sat on the worn-out cot in his small but clean new apartment, staring at the walls. It wasn't much, just a simple room with a bed, a table, and a window that overlooked the street. But to him it felt like a palace, a place of his own, with a door that locked, a place where he wasn't just another forgotten soul sleeping. In the cold, he ran his hand over the folded jacket on his lap. Stallone's jacket, the one he still couldn't quite bring himself to take off. It had been years since anyone had looked at him the way Stallone had. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with respect. A knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, instinct told him to ignore it, to pretend. He wasn't there. Old habits died hard, but something inside told him to get up. He walked to the door, hesitated, then pulled it open. Standing in the dim hallway were the same young men who had tormented him just nights before. John's grip tightened on the doorknob. His first instinct was wariness. Had they come to finish what they started, to mock him again? But then he saw their faces. There was no arrogance this time, no cruel laughter, just uncertainty, guilt, and something that almost looked like shame. The leader of the group, Miguel, he thought he remembered someone calling him, took a step forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "Hey, we just wanted to say—" He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "We were wrong." John said nothing. He crossed his arms, waiting. Another boy, the younger one who had been the first to turn away that night, spoke up. "We acted like idiots. No excuses. It was just stupid." He glanced at Miguel, then at John. "I was talking to my grandfather about it. He was in the war, too." He swallowed hard. "I told him what we did, and he looked at me like he didn't even know who I was." John's expression softened, just slightly. The stocky one, the one who had laughed the hardest that night, let out a deep breath. "We don't expect you to forgive us, man, but we had to say something. We had to try to make it right." John studied them for a long moment. These were the same kids who had shoved him, stolen from him, humiliated him in the street, and yet here they were, standing at his door, admitting their mistakes, owning them. Slowly, John extended his hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, scarred by years of war and hardship. Miguel looked at it, stunned for a second, then reached out and shook it firmly. The others followed. "We all make mistakes," John said, his voice steady. "What matters is what we do next." The boys nodded, the weight of those words settling over them. Miguel cleared his throat. "Look, we know you don't have much stuff. We were thinking maybe we could help move your things over here. You know, as a start." John hesitated, then nodded. "All right." The group spent the next hour retrieving John's few belongings from where he had stashed them near the park bench. A worn duffel bag, an old photo tucked carefully inside, a book with pages nearly falling out from overuse. The boys carried everything with care, as if handling something sacred. When they finished, they stood awkwardly in John's new home, unsure of what to say next. Miguel finally spoke. You got any plans now?" John glanced at Stallone's jacket, then back at them. "Yeah," he said. "I start working at a gym tomorrow." The younger boy's eyes lit up. "No way. That's cool." Miguel grinned slightly. "Guess you're tougher than we thought, old man." John smirked. "Guess so." The group left, but this time, when John watched them go, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The next day, John stepped into the gym, inhaling the scent of sweat, leather, and determination. The place was alive with movement, young fighters working the bags, trainers shouting encouragement. He felt something stir inside him, something that had been buried beneath years of pain and regret. The gym owner, a gruff but kind man named Ray, clapped him on the shoulder. "Stallone said you had some fight in you." John chuckled. "We'll see." Ray handed him a pair of gloves. "Let's get to work." As John moved toward the ring, something caught his eye. Across the gym, near the entrance, Stallone stood watching. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just smiled. John nodded back. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he belonged.